They wore crowns of gold, presided over courts filled with music, art, and splendor, and were hailed as the chosen bloodline of Europe's Renaissance. Yet beneath the marble floors of their palaces ran a poison, a curse woven into their very veins. Tonight, we uncover how one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, obsessed with bloodlines and legacy, descended not into glory, but into madness. Welcome to Eerie Records, where we resurrect the shadows of history, tales of power, betrayal, and forbidden secrets. Before we enter tonight's story, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time of night is it? We love knowing when our dark family gathers. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, the past never rests. It lingers, waiting to be heard. The 1500s, an age of rebirth, but also of hidden decay. While the streets of Florence, Madrid, and Vienna echoed with the sounds of lutes and scholars debating philosophy, Europe was governed by dynasties whose power stretched across kingdoms. Among them, few loomed as large as the Habsburgs, a family that would come to define not just empire, but also the consequences of their own obsession with blood purity. The Renaissance promised progress. Leonardo da Vinci painted the mysteries of the human form. Copernicus dared to move the sun from its divine place, and Michelangelo bent stone into eternal beauty. Yet for all the brilliance of the age, human nature remained tethered to superstition, greed, and vanity. Behind the facades of radiant chapels and candlelit courts, the ruling families of Europe clung to ancient fears. Fears of impurity, fears of losing their bloodline's power, fears of seeing their royal houses fracture into weakness. The Habsburg dynasty embodied both the magnificence and the danger of this period. Emerging from the castles of Austria, they secured crowns through calculated marriages, weaving themselves into the fabric of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond. But it was this very strategy, marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, and sometimes even closer kin, that would turn their empire into a fragile house of cards. The logic was at first simple. Power must not be shared. Lands should not be divided. By binding family to family, the Habsburgs believed they could preserve both wealth and influence. And for a time, this strategy seemed invincible. In 1519, Charles V, grandson of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, rose to power as Holy Roman Emperor. His dominion stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Low Countries to the New World across the Atlantic. It was said that in Charles's empire, the sun never set. But what outsiders did not see were the cracks already forming within. Charles himself was prone to deep melancholy, often withdrawing from court life into long, silent fasts and religious rituals. His infamous jaw, elongated, jutting forward, was the inheritance of generations of intermarriage. Chronic gout plagued him in middle age, while his son Philip II inherited not just his throne, but his instability. What made this dynasty so chilling is not only the madness that would consume it, but the inevitability of it all. The Habsburgs, so determined to preserve themselves, sowed the seeds of their own destruction. As Europe painted frescoes and composed symphonies, the most powerful family in Christendom was quietly collapsing inward. And as the 1500s drew on, whispers began to spread. Whispers of rulers who saw visions, of heirs too sickly to reign, and of a dynasty whose brilliance was giving way to an eerie decline. In the gilded chambers of Renaissance courts, portraits were more than art. They were warnings. The faces of kings and queens captured by painters showed long jaws, narrow temples, and eyes that seemed too weary for youth. These were not simply features of nobility. They were the unmistakable marks of a family that had bound itself too tightly. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen, ordained by God to rule, but divine favor, in their eyes, required vigilance. Lands must never be divided. Thrones must not fall into foreign hands. And so they turned inward, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, until their family tree began to look less like a branching oak and more like a knotted rope, twisted upon itself. The consequences were already visible by the mid-1500s. Chronic illnesses, infertility, and children born weak or deformed were no longer isolated tragedies. They were recurring patterns. In royal archives, whispers emerged of infants who did not survive their first months, of daughters too frail to walk the palace halls, and of princes whose minds seemed elsewhere. Charles V, who wore both the Spanish and Holy Roman crowns, embodied both the strength and fragility of this dynasty. He could command armies across continents, yet he was haunted by crippling depression, migraines so severe he could not speak, and a body twisted by gout. His lower jaw, so large it seemed to unhinge, made eating and speaking painful. Courtiers noted how often he withdrew from councils into prayer, obsessively fasting and flagellating himself, as though the sins of his ancestors weighed visibly upon his shoulders. And Charles was not alone. His relatives across Europe bore the same signs. Joanna of Castile, remembered cruelly by history as Juana la Loca, spent her days wandering palace corridors, speaking to shadows, obsessed with the corpse of her dead husband. She had been Charles's mother. Madness, it seemed, was not an accident of fate. It was an inheritance. Yet despite the evidence, the Habsburgs doubled down. To admit the danger of their practices would have been to admit weakness. And so in 1540, Philip, Charles's son, was wed into the same tangled network of kin. Philip II would go on to be remembered as both Spain's most devout monarch and one of its most paranoid. He saw conspiracies everywhere, spent fortunes on religious relics, and isolated himself within the stone walls of El Escorial, a monastery palace that felt less like a royal seat and more like a tomb. What is chilling is how deliberate it all was. These marriages were not accidents. They were contracts, inked in blood, sealed with blessings, and celebrated as triumphs. No matter how many heirs fell ill, no matter how many queens suffered miscarriages, the dynasty refused to change course. The Habsburg obsession with preserving themselves would become their undoing. And as the Renaissance world looked to them as symbols of order and stability, inside their palaces, the first shadows of collapse had already begun to stir. The dynasty that claimed eternity was building a legacy of madness. By the mid-1500s, whispers were spreading across the palaces of Spain and Austria. Ambassadors wrote back to their homelands, with reports not of military campaigns or political treaties, but of strange behaviors within the Habsburg court. Behind the glittering facade of Renaissance power, madness was no longer confined to private chambers. It was leaking into public life. One of the earliest and most notorious examples was Queen Joanna of Castile, the mother of Charles, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna, the Mad. She had been married to Philip the Handsome, a man whose beauty was matched only by his infidelity. When he died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief turned into something darker. She refused to bury him, travelling across Castile with his coffin, opening it again and again to gaze upon his decaying face. At night, she ordered guards to keep other women away, terrified that even in death he might betray her. To courtiers, this was a scandal beyond comprehension. To her children, it was an inheritance waiting to blossom. Madness had entered the bloodline long before the dynasty's golden age. Charles V himself, though hailed as one of Europe's greatest monarchs, displayed troubling traits. His rages were sudden and unpredictable, followed by days of silence and despair. He confessed to priests that he was haunted by visions, shadows of devils that followed him in his chambers. In council, his paranoia sometimes led him to question the loyalty of even his closest allies. His son, Philip II, inherited more than just the crown. He carried with him a suffocating paranoia that would define his reign. Philip rarely smiled, preferring the cold silence of his palace monastery, El Escorial. He obsessed over religious ritual, spending hours in prayer, and kept relics of saints as though they might ward off his growing fears. Some nights, servants claimed he paced the stone corridors, whispering to himself, convinced that the devil lingered just out of sight. And then there were the children, who never lived long enough to rule. Records tell of heirs born with twisted spines, fragile lungs, and deformities that made survival impossible. In an age where child mortality was already high, the Habsburgs seemed cursed with an excess of tragedy. Each loss was explained away as God's will, never as the consequence of their relentless intermarriage. What terrified those within the court was not just the fragility of bodies, but the fragility of minds. A prince might appear healthy in youth, only to succumb to delusions in adulthood. A princess might be wed abroad, only for her new family to write letters back, describing her uncontrollable moods, her sobbing fits, her sleepless nights. Europe watched in silence, for to question the Habsburgs was to question the very order of Christendom. Yet within their halls, the truth could not be hidden. The dynasty's brilliant facade was cracking, and behind it was not strength, but a growing madness that no crown could disguise. By the second half of the 1500s, the gilded palaces of Spain and Austria were not only the centres of power, they had become echo chambers of rumour. Servants whispered in kitchens, scribes murmured in archives, and foreign ambassadors wrote reports that carried across Europe like wildfire. The whispers were always the same. Something was wrong with the Habsburgs. At the court of Madrid, servants who attended Philip II grew uneasy. Their king, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, preferred solitude to celebration. Banquets that once dazzled foreign dignitaries were replaced with nights of cold silence in El Escorial, his stone monastery palace. Its corridors, vast and echoing, were lit dimly by torches, casting long shadows where Philip walked alone, muttering prayers and clutching relics of saints. Courtiers noted he rarely looked people in the eyes, as though seeing something beyond them, something only he could perceive. Ambassadors, tasked with flattering their hosts, instead sent coded warnings home. The Venetian envoy wrote of Philip's gloomy nature, describing how he sat for hours in silence during councils, unmoving, lips pressed tight as though guarding secrets no one else could know. Another observer remarked that Philip believed himself chosen to defend the faith, yet his devotion seemed more like obsession, an endless spiral of fear that demons and heretics conspired against him at every turn. In Vienna, where the Austrian branch of the dynasty ruled, similar whispers spread. Young archdukes showed signs of mental instability, sudden rages, uncontrollable weeping, and paranoia that courtiers could not hide. Letters between noble families hinted at what was never said aloud, that the Habsburg blood itself was poisoned, carrying not just deformity of body but of mind. Among the common people, rumours took on lives of their own. In the markets of Madrid, one might hear tales that the royal family was cursed by God for its sins. In the taverns of Vienna, drinkers claimed the dynasty had made a pact with dark forces, trading sanity for power. Even in monasteries, monks debated whether the endless tragedies of royal stillbirths and illnesses were divine punishment for incestuous unions. The most dangerous whispers, however, came from rival courts. In France, in England, in the Italian states, enemies of the Habsburgs seized upon these rumours to paint them as unfit rulers. Pamphlets circulated, mocking their long jaws and their melancholy rulers. Rival princes declared that the mighty empire was hollow, a house of glass ready to shatter. Yet inside the Habsburg courts, denial reigned. Physicians were instructed to describe ailments as minor, to disguise deformities, to explain madness as exhaustion. The dynasty clung to its rituals of control, lavish processions, public masses, the endless display of power. But the truth was already out. Europe was watching, and Europe was whispering. The mighty Habsburg name still commanded fear and respect. But beneath the surface, it had become synonymous with a far more unsettling word: madness. If the Habsburg dynasty's decline could be embodied in a single figure, it was Prince Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain, born in 1545. Carlos carried within him the weight of generations of intermarriage, and the curse that came with it. From his earliest years, it was clear something was deeply wrong. As a child, he suffered from physical deformities. His body was frail, his legs twisted. His head, abnormally large, was described by physicians as misshapen. He walked with difficulty, often in pain, yet his tutors soon discovered that his physical ailments were only the surface. His temper was violent, uncontrollable, and terrifying. By adolescence, Don Carlos had become notorious within the palace. Servants lived in fear of his sudden outbursts. On one occasion, he attempted to set fire to a stable simply to watch the flames consume the animals. On another, he forced a shoemaker to eat the very shoes he had crafted, punishing him for failing to meet the prince's standards. His cruelty was not hidden behind closed doors. It was whispered about openly, fueling the growing sense that the heir to Spain's throne was unfit to rule. Yet in the rigid logic of dynastic succession, there was no escaping his fate. Carlos was the only male heir, the empire that stretched from Europe to the New World, an empire on which the sun never set, was destined to be placed in his trembling, violent hands. By the 1560s, Europe's enemies knew of Carlos's instability. Foreign ambassadors reported his behavior to their courts with astonishment, describing him as mad, violent, and dangerous. Yet in Spain, Philip II wrestled with a terrible dilemma. To crown his son was to risk disaster, but to disinherit him was to expose the fragility of the dynasty. The breaking point came in 1568, when Don Carlos was accused of conspiring to flee Spain and join forces with the Dutch, rebels who were rising against Philip's rule. For Spain, already burdened by religious wars and political unrest, this was unthinkable. Philip acted swiftly. In a decision that shocked Europe, he ordered his own son imprisoned in the palace. What followed remains shrouded in mystery. For 6 months, Don Carlos languished in confinement. Accounts from guards describe his violent rages, his self-harm, and his refusal to eat. Then, in July of that same year, the 23-year-old prince was found dead. Officially, the cause was illness. Unofficially, whispers spread that Philip himself had ordered poison to silence his son forever. The death of Don Carlos was more than a personal tragedy. It was a revelation. The dynasty's very future was unstable, its heirs too weak or too dangerous to lead. Europe's most powerful empire had no solid ground beneath it. In Don Carlos, the world saw the truth. The Habsburgs had long tried to hide. Their legacy of power was also a legacy of madness. For centuries, the Habsburgs had treated marriage not as a matter of love, but as a weapon of power. Every union was a political calculation, a means to secure land, titles, and alliances. But by the late 1500s, their relentless obsession with keeping blood pure was no longer a strength. It had become a curse. Nowhere was this more evident than in the marriage contracts. Drawn up between close kin, cousins were joined as husband and wife, uncles wed their nieces, and generations of intermarriage folded back upon themselves. Each ceremony was conducted with pomp and grandeur, but behind the vows lingered a silent truth. These were not celebrations of new beginnings, but repetitions of the same fragile line. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs offers the clearest picture of this decline. Philip II, after the death of his third wife, took his own niece, Anna of Austria, as his fourth queen. The union was defended as a political necessity, a way of strengthening ties between the Spanish and Austrian courts. But the cost was written on the bodies of their children. Of the 5 infants born to Philip and Anna, only one survived beyond childhood, the boy who would become Philip III. Philip III himself was a shadow of the monarch his father had been. Weak in health and passive in spirit, he preferred the company of advisors and favorites to the responsibilities of governance. His reign saw the empire slowly weaken, not from conquest abroad but from stagnation within. While his ministers ruled in his name, Philip spent his time in prayer and ceremony, seemingly detached from the reality of his collapsing empire. And yet the cycle continued. Philip III, bound by duty to the dynasty, married his cousin Margaret of Austria. Their children were plagued by the same hereditary afflictions, weak constitutions, illnesses that struck in youth, and features unmistakably marked by generations of intermarriage. The Habsburg jaw, once a minor curiosity, now appeared grotesque. Some princes could not chew properly, others spoke with difficulty, and still more succumbed to childhood fevers before reaching adulthood. Foreign observers were not blind to these tragedies. Italian physicians quietly remarked that the dynasty's blood had been corrupted. French envoys mocked the Spanish court, whispering that God himself was closing the Habsburg line. Even within Spain, nobles began to wonder if their rulers were touched by a curse. But to the dynasty, these warnings went unheard. Each marriage contract was inked with the same logic: better to bind blood with blood than risk losing power to outsiders. They did not see that in sealing their family tree so tightly, they were strangling it. By the dawn of the 1600s, the Habsburgs had created a dynasty that looked invincible on maps, yet was fragile in flesh. Their empire stretched across oceans, but their heirs, frail and sickly, were born already burdened with doom. The marriage bed had become their battlefield, and in it, the Habsburgs were losing the war. As the Habsburgs grew weaker, their empire still demanded strength. But when medicine failed them and marriages only worsened their plight, they turned increasingly to faith and to superstition. In Renaissance Europe, the line between the sacred and the mystical was thin, and the Habsburgs walked it with trembling steps. Their palaces were filled with relics, fragments of saints' bones, splinters of the true cross, drops of blood said to be Christ's. Philip II, in particular, was consumed with religious devotion. At his vast monastery palace, El Escorial, he surrounded himself with relics numbering in the thousands. He believed that holiness itself could be collected like treasure, and that perhaps, by living among saints' remains, his family's curse could be kept at bay. But prayers alone could not mend the frailties of flesh. The dynasty's children continued to die young, their bodies weakened by the very unions meant to secure their power. Some physicians quietly warned of bad blood, though few dared to speak the truth aloud. Others suggested that dark forces were at work, that the family's repeated tragedies were not natural, but the result of a divine punishment. Whispers of a curse spread through the court. The Habsburgs had risen high, too high, some murmured. Their empire stretched from Europe to the New World, and such vast dominion could not exist without angering God. Others believed the curse was ancestral, that long-forgotten sins, perhaps betrayals or forbidden unions, had poisoned the bloodline itself. Desperate, the family sought remedies beyond reason. Midwives and mystics were brought into the royal chambers, instructed to weave charms of protection. Holy water was sprinkled over cradles. Talismans were tied around infants' necks, meant to ward off the evil eye. And always there were prayers, long, obsessive prayers that filled the monasteries and chapels until the stone walls seemed to echo with sorrow. Philip III, frail and pious, leaned heavily on confessors and advisors steeped in theology. It was said he spent more time in prayer than in council, convinced that the fate of Spain itself hinged on divine favor. Yet, as he prayed, the empire declined and his heirs grew weaker still. Even the common people began to question the family's strength. When royal processions passed through Madrid or Valladolid, subjects whispered about the pale skin, the jutting jaw, the glassy eyes of their rulers. Were these the marks of divine kingship or of a family decayed from within? By the time Philip IV came to the throne, superstition was no longer confined to whispers. He consulted astrologers to select auspicious dates, relied on confessors to absolve the dynasty's sins, and clung to relics as if they alone could stop the slow unraveling of his bloodline. Yet no relic, no prayer, no whispered charm could halt what had already been set in motion. The Habsburgs were slipping further into weakness, and the eyes of Europe watched hungrily. Their curse, whether divine or self-inflicted, was becoming impossible to ignore. By the late 1600s, the Habsburg dynasty stood on the edge of ruin. Its empire still stretched across Europe and the Americas, but inside the royal chambers, the legacy of centuries of inbreeding revealed its cruelest expression. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, would come to symbolize not glory, but decay. Born in 1661, Charles was frail from the beginning. His jaw, grotesquely extended by generations of Habsburg marriages, made it nearly impossible for him to chew food or even speak clearly. His body was twisted, his legs weak, his mind clouded. To many, he looked less like a king and more like the living embodiment of a curse. Physicians who examined him declared in hushed tones that he was unable to breed, sealing the family's fate. As Charles grew, his court clung to desperate hope. They surrounded him with relics and healers, trying to coax health into a body that refused to obey. But the young king could barely walk without support. He was prone to seizures, illnesses, and sudden fits of melancholy. Ambassadors who visited Madrid carried back whispered reports that the King of Spain was little more than a broken child in a man's throne. Yet, despite his condition, Charles was married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Mariana of Neuburg. Both unions, arranged in hopes of producing an heir, ended in failure. The Queen's wombs remained empty, and with each passing year, the Spanish court sank deeper into despair. Whispers spread that Charles was bewitched, cursed from birth, or perhaps already claimed by the devil himself. As the last male heir of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles bore the unbearable weight of a collapsing dynasty. The empire around him was decaying. Armies lost battles. The treasury drained, and famine swept through Spain. Meanwhile, foreign powers circled like vultures, waiting for the inevitable, the extinction of the Habsburg bloodline. Charles himself seemed haunted by the knowledge of his role. He spent long nights in prayer, fasting and begging for deliverance. In 1699, terrified of his impending death, he even ordered his body to be exorcised by priests. Witnesses claimed that his chambers echoed with chants, holy water, and the burning of sacred incense. A king treated not as a sovereign, but as a man possessed. In 1700, at just 38 years old, Charles II died, leaving no children and no hope for the continuation of his line. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a bloody struggle that would redraw the map of Europe. But within the walls of El Escorial, his death was seen as something else, the final payment of a debt written in blood. The dynasty that had ruled half the world had collapsed, not under the swords of its enemies, but under the weight of its own cursed inheritance. The Habsburgs had reached too high, too far, and their blood had carried the price. The death of Charles, II in 1700, did not just mark the end of a king. It was the death knell of a dynasty that had once stood unshakable. For centuries, the Habsburg name had carried the weight of empires, commanding respect, fear, and awe. Yet now, in the flickering candlelight of Madrid's royal chambers, the once mighty family line lay extinguished. But the world is not kind to endings. When the Spanish Habsburgs died, they left behind not only a political vacuum, but a legacy of whispers, superstition, and dread. The term Habsburg curse began to spread, capturing the imagination of Europe. Was their downfall truly the result of politics and biology, or had something darker been at work? Across the continent, rumours multiplied. Some claimed the dynasty had been punished by God for their relentless pride and vanity. Others whispered of ancient pacts, that centuries earlier, the Habsburgs had bargained with forces not of heaven, swearing loyalty to ambition itself, a dynasty that had swallowed half the world. people reasoned, must surely have owed its power to something beyond mere strategy. And what the devil gives, the devil always takes back. The haunting image of the Habsburg jaw became a living symbol of this legend. Portraits of Maximilian I, Philip IV, and Charles II were passed around Europe like morbid trophies. Children stared at them with a mix of curiosity and fear. Writers, poets, and historians all fed the narrative. Here was proof that blood itself could be cursed, that power hoarded too greedily would rot from within. And yet, the irony was that the Habsburgs themselves had believed in curses too. Charles II's obsession with exorcisms, his reliance on relics and saints, and the endless rituals performed in his chambers, revealed a dynasty that had begun to believe in its own doom. They were not only victims of poor genetic choices, they were prisoners of their own superstition. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs unleashed chaos across Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession, 707-14, dragged the continent into bloodshed, reshaping alliances and shifting borders. France, Austria, England, and countless smaller states clashed for control of the empire's remains. The Habsburgs of Austria continued to rule for another 2 centuries, but their Spanish cousins had vanished forever, consumed by their own bloodline. In the taverns, marketplaces, and shadowed alleys of Europe, the tale of the Habsburg curse lived on. It was repeated like a ghost story, a warning that no throne, no crown, and no lineage is immune from the slow, relentless hand of fate. The dynasty that once believed it was eternal had been reduced to a legend, and not a flattering one. Their castles stood, their portraits survived, their coins remained in circulation. But their blood had betrayed them, and in the end, history remembered not their victories, but their downfall. And so, with the death of Charles II in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, once an empire stretching across oceans, continents, and centuries, crumbled into dust. What began as a family blessed with crowns and kingdoms had ended in sickness, madness, and silence. But perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that power itself carries a hidden cost. The Habsburgs were not destroyed by armies or assassins, but by their own choices. In their hunger to preserve a pure bloodline, they sowed the very seeds of their downfall. Generation after generation, they closed their doors, wedded their cousins, and defied nature until their lineage was no longer a legacy, but a prison. The portraits that remain today tell the story better than words. Look into the painted eyes of Philip IV or the twisted jawline of Charles II, and you glimpse a family that believed themselves destined to rule forever. Yet behind the gilded frames, behind the solemn gazes, there is fragility. The flesh betrays what the crown tried to conceal. Legends of the Habsburg curse still echo through time, whispered in classrooms, libraries, and late-night tales. Was it a curse at all, or simply the unrelenting hand of biology? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps destiny punishes the proud not with fire and lightning, but with a slow unraveling, a rot so quiet it can only be seen across generations. The Spanish throne passed to a new house, wars reshaped the map, and history moved forward. But the shadows of the Habsburgs linger. Their story remains etched into Europe's memory as a cautionary tale. That dynasties can fall not only by the sword, but by the blood that flows in their own veins. Even now, centuries later, we are left with a chilling question. If the mightiest family of Renaissance Europe could collapse from within, what does that say about the rest of us? History is not merely the story of victories and coronations. It is also the story of decay, silence, and endings. And sometimes, the most haunting ruins are not castles of stone, but families destroyed by their own design. This was the story of the dynasty that fell into madness. You've been watching Eerie Records, where history's darkest truths are laid bare. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time of night you've joined us. If you crave more haunting tales, subscribe and become part of our growing dark family. Because here, the past never sleeps, and neither will you.